She was 18 years old. She had already done something almost no other actor in Hollywood history had ever done. She starred in two of the biggest monster movies on the planet without hearing a single word of dialogue spoken to her on set. She built a real emotional bond with a 200-foot-tall CG gorilla that didn't exist in the room with her. She made A-list actors learn a new language just so they could talk to her between takes. And she did all of it before she'd even graduated high school. This week, the world lost her. Kaylee Hottle, the deaf actress who played Gia in Godzilla vs. Kong and Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, died early Tuesday morning in a car crash in Frederick County, Maryland. She was 18. This is the story of who she was, how a girl from an all-deaf family in Georgia ended up standing next to Kong on a soundstage, why her performance mattered to millions of people who will never see this video, and what actually happened on that road outside a small town called Ijamsville. Stay with me, because there's a lot more to Kaylee Hottle's story than the headlines are telling you. To understand who Kaylee Hottle was, you have to start with her family, because her family is genuinely one of the more remarkable stories in all of this. Kaylee was born in 2007 or 2008. Reports differ slightly. In Atlanta, Georgia, she was deaf from birth. But here's the part that makes her story different from almost any other deaf actor working today. She wasn't the first deaf person in her family to navigate the world this way. Not even close. On her father's side, deafness runs 4 generations deep. Her father, Joshua Hottle, is deaf. Her mother, Kaylee Hottle, is also deaf. And according to her family, Kaylee's own siblings are deaf as well. This wasn't a household where sign language was a skill anyone had to learn as an adult or a specialized accommodation bolted onto an otherwise normal household. American Sign Language was Kaylee's first language, the language she thought in, dreamed in, and grew up laughing in around a dinner table with people who understood her instantly and completely. That distinction matters more than it might sound like on the surface. A huge percentage of deaf children are actually born to hearing parents, which means many deaf kids grow up as the only signer in their own home, learning to navigate a family that's fluent in a language they can't access. Kaylee never had that experience. She was, in the language the deaf community itself often uses, a native signer in a native signing family. She grew up completely fluent, completely confident, surrounded by people who communicated the exact same way she did. That upbringing shaped everything that came next. Because Kaylee wasn't first discovered by some casting agent scouting a mainstream school. Her earliest appearances on camera came through the deaf community itself. As a young child, she appeared in a public service commercial for a video relay service called Convo back in 2017. She also took part in short films made specifically within and for the deaf community. Projects with names like 10 Deaf Children, One Powerful Message, produced by an organization called Assel Nook. These weren't vanity projects. They were part of a broader effort within the deaf community to put authentic representation on screen, real deaf people, signing in their own language, telling their own stories, rather than hearing actors performing deafness as a costume. And it was through that world, the world of deaf made media, casting networks, and community connections. That Kaylee's path toward Hollywood actually began. Not through a talent agency in Los Angeles, through a network built by and for deaf performers. That's the piece a lot of the entertainment coverage this week is glossing over. Kaylee Hottle wasn't a hearing kid who happened to get cast as a deaf character. She was a deaf kid, raised by deaf parents inside a deaf family, discovered through deaf community networks, cast to play a deaf character. Every layer of that casting was authentic. And that authenticity is exactly why her performance ended up resonating the way it did. So here's how it actually happened. When Warner Bros. And Legendary Pictures were casting Godzilla vs. Kong back around 2019 and 2020, they had a specific problem to solve. The film's story needed a young deaf orphan character named Gia, a girl who is the last surviving member of the native people of Skull Island and who forms an emotional, almost telepathic bond with Kong, using sign language to communicate with him in ways no one else on Skull Island can. The studio's casting director, Sarah Halley Finn, didn't want a hearing child actor pretending to sign. She wanted an actual deaf performer. So the production reached out through networks connected to deaf theatre and deaf casting communities, trying to find her. According to reporting on how the casting unfolded, an assistant director who had worked on the earlier film Kong, Skull Island, remembered seeing a young deaf girl in that Convo commercial, the same one Kaylee had appeared in years earlier. That connection is what eventually put her in the room for the role of Gia. Kaylee was around 12 or 13 years old at the time, and by the time the film hit theatres in 2021, she wasn't just the deaf kid in the monster movie. She was one of the most talked about new faces in the entire film, holding her own in scenes against Millie Bobby Brown, Alexander Skarsgård, Rebecca Hall, and a fully digital 200-foot ape. Here's something that's genuinely wild if you stop and think about it. Kaylee had to build a performance, real, believable, emotionally grounded chemistry with a character who was not physically present. Kong didn't exist on set. There was no actor in a suit standing across from her the way there might be in a lot of monster films. In some interviews, Kaylee described the actual experience of shooting those scenes. She was often acting toward markers, tracking dots or laser points on a green screen, and had to imagine an emotional connection that the camera would later fill in digitally. Try to picture that for a second. You're a child actor. You don't just have to act like you're scared of a giant monster or amazed by a giant monster. You have to act like you deeply, wordlessly love a giant monster using a silent language directed at a tennis ball on a stick. And audiences believed it completely. Critics singled her performance out. It was, by a wide margin, one of the most emotionally effective parts of Godzilla vs. Kong. Off camera, something almost as touching was happening. Alexander Skarsgård and Rebecca Hall, her co-stars, reportedly took the time to learn American Sign Language themselves so that they could actually communicate with Kaylee directly between takes, not just through an interpreter, but person to person. For a 13-year-old on her first ever film set, surrounded by veteran adult actors, having them meet her halfway in her own language was clearly something that meant a great deal to her. Her performance as Gia earned her a nomination for the Saturn Award for Best Performance by a Younger Actor, a significant recognition in the genre film world, especially for a debut role. 3 years later, she came back for the sequel, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, released in 2024, again reprising the role of Gia opposite Rebecca Hall. By this point, Kaylee wasn't a rookie anymore. She spoke publicly about how much smoother the second shoot felt compared to the first, now that she understood how green screen acting actually worked. She talked in interviews about hoping deaf audiences, especially deaf kids, would watch Gia on the biggest screen in the world and see themselves reflected back as something powerful, not something fragile. And by all accounts, that's exactly what happened. Deaf children across the country got to watch a movie where the hero wasn't just tolerated for being deaf, she was extraordinary because of who she was, fully, without her deafness being treated as an obstacle to overcome. Outside of the Godzilla franchise, Kaylee was by every account a normal American teenager in the most important ways. She was a senior at the Texas School for the Deaf in Austin, a school with a long, respected history of educating deaf students in a fully signing environment. In interviews, she talked about her classmates the way any teenager would talk about their friends watching them do something cool. She said they thought it was awesome to see one of their own friends up on a giant screen, standing next to Calm. Not treated as some untouchable celebrity, just their friend who happened to be in a Godzilla movie. She'd also picked up a handful of other credits along the way, including an appearance on the long-running CBS series Magnum P.I. She wasn't a one-role phenomenon, she was actively building a career, with more projects reportedly on the horizon. In earlier interviews, going back to when she was just 16 years old on the set of the first film, Kaylee came across as remarkably grounded for someone in the middle of a massive studio blockbuster. She talked about representation, about the responsibility of showing deaf life authentically on screen, and about wanting other deaf kids to see themselves as capable of anything, including standing at the center of a $200 million movie. That's the person the world lost this week. Not just the Godzilla girl, a senior in high school, a working actor building a real career, a member of a tight-knit deaf community and a tight-knit family. Someone who, by every description available, took her platform seriously and used it to open a door for other deaf performers coming up behind her now. Let's talk about what actually happened. Because there's been some confusion in early reporting, and it's worth laying out clearly and carefully what investigators have said so far. According to the Frederick County Sheriff's Office in Maryland, the crash happened in the early morning hours on Tuesday, just before 3 a.m., in a small community called Ijamsville. Kaylee was one of two passengers riding in a 1995 Honda Accord. The vehicle was being driven by a 19-year-old man from Frederick. Investigators say the car went off the right side of a two-lane road and struck a culvert, essentially a drainage structure built under or alongside the roadway. Based on the preliminary investigation, authorities believe excessive speed was a contributing factor in the crash. The full investigation is still ongoing, so the final official findings haven't been released yet. The driver was taken to a local hospital with injuries that were described as non-life-threatening. The second passenger in the car declined medical treatment at the scene. Kaylee, tragically, did not survive. She was airlifted from the scene of the crash to a hospital, but according to her father, her heart had already stopped before she arrived. It's worth pausing here because this is the part of the story that turns it from a headline into something almost unbearably human. This wasn't a case where a family got a call and immediately knew the outcome. Her father has described how he first learned there had been a serious accident, and only afterward received the follow-up call telling him she hadn't made it. That's an agonizing sequence for any parent to live through, and it's part of why his public statements this week have carried so much raw grief. Investigators haven't released the identity of the driver publicly, respecting his age and the fact that the investigation is still active. He has been described only as a 19-year-old Frederick, Maryland resident. What made the aftermath of this tragedy stand out, even among other celebrity-adjacent tragedies, is how Kaylee's family chose to share their grief. Not through a written statement issued by a publicist, not through a spokesperson reading a prepared quote to cameras, but directly in American Sign Language. Filmed on their own phones and posted straight to social media. Joshua Hottle, Kaylee's father, was in Texas when he learned what had happened. He posted a video, recorded from an airport, explaining in Azle that he was about to board a flight he never wanted to take, traveling to Maryland to bring his daughter's body home. He described his wife and Kaylee's 4 siblings as devastated, gathered together at their home, grieving as a family. He later spoke for nearly 23 minutes in a live stream, walking through, in his own language, exactly what had happened, from the first phone call telling him about the crash to the second call telling him his daughter hadn't survived. He said he was deeply grateful for the 18 years he had with her, and that he only wished there had been more of them. There's another detail from his statements that's worth sitting with for a moment. Joshua Hottle also addressed the young driver directly, the 19-year-old who had been behind the wheel. Rather than expressing anger toward him, he said in Azle that he forgave him, and told him not to let this one incident define or ruin the rest of his life. That is an extraordinary thing to say in the immediate, raw aftermath of losing a child. Grief doesn't usually make room for grace that fast. But it tells you something about who this family is and how they chose to carry this moment publicly, with devastation, yes, but without cruelty toward a teenager who will now have to live with what happened on that road for the rest of his life. Kaylee's mother, Ketsi, also posted her own message in Azle, saying that she still feels her daughter's presence with her. The tributes came quickly and from some genuinely significant names. Her Godzilla vs. Kong co-star Rebecca Hall, who played Gia's adoptive mother on screen, posted a tribute on social media alongside photos of the two of them together on set, writing that she was devastated by the news and that her heart went out to Kaylee's family. Marlee Matlin, the first deaf actor to ever win an Academy Award and one of the most significant figures in the history of deaf representation in Hollywood, also paid tribute, writing that she was heartbroken over the loss and hoped Kaylee's talent and warmth would be remembered. Millicent Simmons, the deaf actress known for her role in A Quiet Place, reached out directly to Kaylee's mother with a personal message, calling Kaylee a light. And Kaylee's own school, the Texas School for the Deaf in Austin, released a statement calling her death a tremendous loss for their entire community, noting that she was a senior there and that counseling resources would be made available to students and staff processing the news. Taken together, these tributes tell you something important. Kaylee Hottle wasn't just admired from a distance as a talented young performer. Within the actual community of deaf actors and deaf advocates, the people who best understood exactly what she represented, she was seen as one of their own and as someone who mattered. It's worth stepping back and asking why a teenage actress with only 3 screen credits generated this much genuine grief across the entertainment industry. Part of the answer is simple: representation. For decades, deaf characters in film and television were overwhelmingly played by hearing actors, often communicating in exaggerated or inauthentic ways designed for a hearing audience rather than reflecting real deaf culture or real ASL. Kaylee's casting reversed that. A real deaf actress, from a real deaf family, playing a deaf character using real sign language. Inside one of the biggest blockbuster franchises on the planet, watched by tens of millions of people worldwide who had never previously seen a deaf performer anchor a movie of that scale. For deaf children specifically, that mattered enormously. A kid who grows up signing, who may have rarely or never seen someone who communicates exactly the way they do standing at the emotional center of a giant summer blockbuster, suddenly got to see exactly that. Gia wasn't a side character defined by her disability. She was arguably the emotional heart of both films, the one character capable of truly understanding Kong, in a way none of the hearing, speaking characters around her ever could. That's not a small thing. Representation like that shapes how kids see their own future, what they think is possible for someone like them. Kaylee talked about this responsibility openly in interviews more than once, saying she hoped deaf audiences would watch her performance and see themselves as capable of being just as extraordinary as she believed Gia to be. That's the legacy people in the industry are grieving right now, not just a promising young actress with more films ahead of her, though that's true too. They're grieving the loss of someone who had already, at 18 years old, changed what was possible for authentic representation in one of the largest film franchises in the world. As of this recording, the crash remains under active investigation by the Frederick County Sheriff's Office. Investigators have said excessive speed is believed to be a contributing factor, but a final. Official determination of contributing causes typically comes later, once the full investigation concludes. The surviving passenger and the driver are both expected to cooperate with that ongoing investigation. No charges have been publicly announced at this stage. Kaylee's body was expected to be returned to Texas, where her family and community at the Texas School for the Deaf are now grieving together. Given the size of her platform and the significance of her role in deaf representation on screen, it's likely we'll see more public tributes in the days ahead, potentially including statements from Warner Bros., Legendary Pictures, and additional cast and crew from the Godzilla vs. Kong films. Kaylee Hottle spent her entire short life inside 2 worlds that most people never get to see up close. A multi-generational deaf family built on a language most of us will never speak, and a Hollywood blockbuster machine most of us will never step inside. She managed to make both of those worlds a little bit bigger, a little more visible, and a little more understood for millions of people who will remember her as Gia long after this week's headlines fade. Her father said it best. In the same language she grew up speaking her entire life, he was grateful for 18 years with her, and he wished there had been more. If this video meant something to you, let me know in the comments, and if you want to see more stories like this one, the real people behind the biggest names in entertainment, subscribe because there's more coming. Rest in peace, Kaylee.